In 1720, a French military engineer released a revised atlas of European fortifications, a technical document intended to standardize defensive planning. The drawings were precise, star-shaped polygons, evenly angled bastions, and walls laid out with mathematical consistency. Officially, these designs were framed as solutions to artillery warfare. Yet, as I examined earlier and later plans from Italy, Russia, South America, and South Asia, I noticed the same geometry appearing in places with no shared military doctrine, no synchronized conflict, and no clear record of how this knowledge traveled. Over time, many of these structures were renamed. Some became public parks, others were absorbed into administrative districts or prisons. Their original layouts were softened, obscured, or partially dismantled. In several cases, their size exceeded any documented defensive requirement, while their orientation seemed indifferent to terrain. Today, satellite imagery reveals these shapes with clarity unavailable to earlier historians. As modern cities expand around them, the persistence of this geometry raises a broader question. If these were simply forts, why do they appear everywhere? And why does their origin remain so quietly unresolved?
When I first approached star forts as a subject, I began with the explanation that appears in nearly every academic source. According to conventional military history, star forts emerged in early modern Europe as a response to gunpowder artillery. Tall medieval walls, once effective against siege engines, became vulnerable to cannon fire. Engineers adapted by lowering walls, thickening ramparts, and projecting angular bastions to eliminate blind spots. This narrative is supported by treatises written between the 16th and 18th centuries. Figures such as Vauban are frequently cited as innovators who refined these designs through practical battlefield experience. In this framework, geometry is not symbolic or systemic, it is functional. Angles deflect cannonballs. Bastions provide overlapping fields of fire. Moats slow advancing infantry. I examined military manuals that explain these principles in detail. They emphasize visibility, range, and the economics of defense. A well-designed fort, according to these texts, minimizes manpower while maximizing resistance. The star shape, therefore, is presented as an optimization problem solved through mathematics and experience. This explanation also frames star forts as regionally adapted. Climate, terrain, and political boundaries are said to influence their final form. A coastal fort differs from an inland one. Mountain terrain demands different solutions than flat plains. In theory, no two forts should be identical. Within this accepted view, star forts are transitional. They belong to a specific period between medieval castles and modern fortifications. Once artillery improved further, even star forts became obsolete. They were abandoned, dismantled, or absorbed into growing cities. At first glance, this explanation appears internally consistent. It aligns with documented wars, known engineers, and surviving texts. It also fits comfortably within a linear model of technological progress. Fortifications evolve as weapons evolve. When weapons change again, fortifications fade. At this stage of my investigation, I did not challenge this narrative. I treated it as the baseline against which any anomaly would need to be measured. If contradictions existed, they would have to appear in the physical structures themselves, not in speculation. It was only when I began comparing specific examples rather than theoretical descriptions that the first inconsistencies became difficult to ignore.
As I began examining individual star forts in detail, I noticed features that did not sit comfortably within the accepted military explanation. Some forts were built in areas with no recorded history of siege warfare. Others were positioned far from borders or trade routes where the likelihood of attack was minimal. Scale was the first issue that stood out. Several star forts were vast, enclosing areas far larger than any garrison could reasonably occupy. The manpower required to defend every bastion would have exceeded the population of nearby settlements. In these cases, the official explanation does not fully account for why such resources were invested. Symmetry presented another problem. While military engineers valued efficiency, perfect geometric symmetry is not always advantageous in real terrain. Yet many forts display near-perfect radial balance, even when the surrounding landscape would have favored irregular adaptation. In some cases, hills, rivers, or coastlines appear secondary to maintaining the geometric plan. Orientation also raised questions. Defensive structures are typically aligned to control access routes or dominate high ground, yet I found examples where star forts were oriented independently of these factors. Their angles seemed determined more by internal geometry than by external threat. I examined records describing construction timelines. In several cases, forts of extraordinary complexity were completed with remarkable speed. This suggests either an unusually high level of coordination or the reuse of existing foundations. The documents, however, do not clarify this. What struck me was not a single contradiction, but their accumulation. Each individual case could be explained away, but together they suggest that defense may not have been the sole design driver. The official narrative explains how star forts could function defensively. It does not fully explain why they were built in these specific forms, in these specific places. At this point, I did not assume alternative purposes. I simply noted that the evidence raised questions the standard explanation does not fully resolve. To understand whether these anomalies were isolated, I widened my scope of investigation beyond Europe.
When I expanded my research geographically, the pattern became more difficult to dismiss. Star-shaped fortifications appear not only across Europe, but in South America, North Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and Russia. In many of these regions, the forts predate or exist independently of European military occupation. I compared layouts using scaled maps and satellite imagery. The proportions were strikingly consistent. The angles of the bastions, the ratios between inner courtyards and outer walls, and the spacing of defensive points often match within narrow margins. This consistency suggests shared design principles rather than isolated experimentation. What complicates the accepted explanation is the absence of clear transmission pathways. There is little documentation showing how specific engineering knowledge moved between continents at the necessary speed and scale. In some cases, forts appear in regions before any recorded presence of European military engineers. I also noticed that many of these structures appear layered into urban environments rather than imposed upon them. Cities grow around the forts, not always because of strategic necessity, but because the structures already occupy central, organized space. Maps provide further clues. Early cartographic records sometimes depict star forts with minimal explanation, as if their presence required no justification. Later maps often simplify or omit these features altogether, especially as cities modernize. The repetition of geometry, placement, and scale across cultures raises a structural question. If these forts were purely military, why do they follow such a rigid global template? If they were adapted locally, why is their variation so limited? At this stage, the evidence suggests coordination at the level of design logic, if not centralized control. Something shaped these structures beyond immediate military need. To explore that possibility, it became necessary to look beyond surface function and examine the internal logic of the designs themselves.
When I began analyzing star forts as systems rather than defenses, a different interpretation became possible. The geometry itself appears optimized not only for visibility but for distribution. The radial layout creates evenly spaced nodes connected by straight corridors. This configuration is efficient for movement, circulation, and control. Inside many star forts, I found extensive internal infrastructure. Drainage systems are often more advanced than those of surrounding cities. Subterranean passages connect bastions in ways not required for combat. In some cases, these passages align with underground channels extending beyond the fort's perimeter. The placement of star forts also suggests nodal function. They often sit at the center of road networks, waterways, or administrative districts. This raises the question of whether they served as hubs rather than outposts. Geometry plays a critical role here. Radial designs minimize distance between center and edge. They distribute load evenly. These principles are not exclusive to fortification. They appear in systems designed for circulation and balance. I also examined orientation. Several forts align with cardinal directions or solar paths rather than terrain features. While this does not prove intent, it suggests that geometry itself held priority. What is notably absent is evidence of incremental modification. These structures appear fully realized at construction. They are not gradually adapted, they are built complete, then later altered or dismantled. The official explanation treats star forts as isolated military solutions. The evidence suggests they may have functioned as integrated systems within larger networks. That does not mean they were not defensive. It means defense may have been one function among others. This interpretation does not require speculative technology. It requires only that geometry and planning served broader organizational purposes. Whether administrative, logistical, or infrastructural, the design logic points beyond warfare alone. Understanding why these systems disappeared requires examining what happened after their construction.
Renaming, repurposing, and historical silence. As star forts lost their apparent military relevance, their transformation followed a consistent pattern. Names changed, functions shifted, records thinned. In many cities, forts became parks, barracks, or civic spaces. Their geometric form was softened through landscaping or partial demolition. I examined administrative records documenting these changes. The language is neutral. Terms like obsolete, redeveloped, or integrated appear frequently. What is missing is analysis. There is little discussion of why these structures were built as they were or what was lost in their transformation. Maps offer further evidence of omission. Early detailed plans give way to simplified representations. Internal layouts disappear. Subterranean features are rarely noted. Over time, the forts become shapes without context. This process appears methodical rather than chaotic. There is no sign of emergency destruction. Instead, there is gradual absorption into new urban narratives. Defense gives way to leisure. Geometry gives way to aesthetics. The official explanation frames this as progress. Cities evolve. Old structures make room for new needs. That may be true, but progress does not require forgetting design logic. Yet forgetting appears to have occurred. Whether this reflects bureaucratic indifference or deliberate simplification remains unclear. The records do not explain the decision. They simply reflect its outcome. By the 19th century, many star forts are no longer discussed as engineered systems. They are historical curiosities, stripped of analytical depth. Their geometry remains visible, but their purpose fades from inquiry. This silence sets the stage for modern rediscovery. Modern visibility and unresolved questions. With the advent of satellite imagery, star forts have become visible in ways earlier historians could not access. From above, their geometry stands out clearly, even when partially obscured by modern development. Patterns once fragmented by local perspective now appear unmistakably global. I compared modern images with historical maps. The continuity is striking. Despite centuries of alteration, the underlying shapes persist. They resist complete erasure. Modern explanations remain rooted in military history, yet the evidence now available allows for broader questioning. If these structures were purely defensive, why do they share such precise geometry across cultures and continents? If they were transitional, why were they built so extensively? These questions do not demand definitive answers. They demand reconsideration. The star forts challenge the assumption that early modern engineering was narrowly reactive. They suggest planning at a scale not fully acknowledged. As cities continue to expand, these structures remain embedded within urban systems. They influence road layouts, property boundaries, and infrastructure flow, often invisibly. What remains unresolved is not whether star forts existed, but whether their purpose has been fully understood. The evidence suggests complexity, it suggests intention, it suggests coordination. The question is not what these structures were, but why their design logic was set aside so quietly, and whether, in overlooking that logic, we are missing insights into how large systems were once organized. For now, the geometry remains, the explanations remain incomplete, and the questions, once again visible from above, remain open.